We are MythVision. Welcome back. We're going to be debating a topic today on whether or not a miracle happened in 701 BC when the Assyrians were ruling the world practically. And today I have Dr. Mott. It's really Dr. Matthew Monger who's joining us. How you doing, my friend?
Hey, thanks. Good to be here, Derek. Great.
I'm glad you're joining us as well. And Jonathan Sheffield, my friend, who actually made that intro. I really appreciate you joining. How you doing, Jonathan?
No, doing great, and great to be back with Dr. Matthew Monger. Call him Matthew. But yeah, great again to sit down with you, Matthew, and share my thesis.
Well, in case anyone's wondering, Mott, I think, means death. And so he's bringing death, which is optimistic, of course. You know, it's a positive thing. But seriously, go subscribe to Jonathan's YouTube channel. He is a very good friend of mine, and he has helped with the cartoons that we do here. We talk almost every day. We have a bromance. Okay, let's just publicly put it out there. We have a bromance, and it is what it is. But we do have in our next live the one that's coming up with you, Jonathan. We're going to be doing something special, and I'm just quickly promoting that to let people know that those who we're going to have the numbers right, but those who help the channel by super chatting during that next debate, which is going to be with you and Dr. Robin Faith Walsh on who wrote the Gospels. Did the disciples actually write the Gospels or not? And if people help super chat, you're going to create cartoons, up to 5 intro cartoons or 30-second cartoons for anybody who helps support the channel. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that and help out the channel. You're not just giving for free. We're probably going to do like a raffle pulling or something, and I'll have Mrs. MythVision come help us out. You can put your name into it, and we'll do the pulling at the end. Anyway, go subscribe. I want to try and get him up to 2,000 subscribers for his hard work and all the cartoons he's been putting together and helping these ideas come to MythVision. Dr. Monger is on academia. I highly recommend you get acquainted with his work. We did an amazing episode on Jubilees, and it made me go, wow, was there really a fixed canon? You might want to, reinvestigate that question. And so anyway, Dr. Monger is going to be coming back to MythVision more and more, I hope, bringing that death with him. And also consider Patreon with MythVision, working our butt off. We have hundreds of videos that are there for you to access. I just recently brought old videos to the top. 18 never before seen with Elaine Pagels. I've got John J. Collins, Joel Baden, Joshua Bowen. The list goes on and on and on and on. You name it. James Tabor. Who else? Just a lot. There's a lot. There's tons of videos in there. So consider helping us out there. And I, once again, thank you for joining. Everybody, super chat your questions or your comments, remarks, because vicariously you can engage into this debate by the Q&A session and challenging either one of the opponents here on the topic by the end of the debate. If you super chat, Dr. Mott and Jonathan brought this up. If you super chat above $100 or 100, then we can interrupt them during cross-examination and have you engage. This is very different than what we usually do. I'm only going with their flow here. But thank you. Let's start. Where do I need to start in reading to get people acquainted with this subject matter?
Yep. If you just read Isaiah 36:1 and just that one verse, just to kind of let them know where Jonathan's taking his cues.
Okay. Well, I want making sure everybody can see. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennarcherib, I'm just going to say, or Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Then the king of Assyria sent his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. When the commander stopped at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to Lauderer's field, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, the palace administrator, Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, I hope I'm saying that right, the recorder, went out to him. Do I need to continue?
That's enough. That's plenty.
And then there's also
we'll fill in the gaps later. We're good.
Just so everybody knows, here in 2 Kings 18 as well. So,
yeah.
Okay. Awesome. We're gonna have Jonathan go first, since Jonathan is actually bringing I believe there's a miracle here. And you're going to have a 15-minute introduction. And then we're going to have Dr. Death come in after. And I don't know. It feels cool saying that. So anyway, yeah, let's go ahead and share your screen, Jonathan, and get the party started.
Okay, let me know when you can see my screen.
I can.
Okay.
I'll start the timer. We're going to put 15 minutes up.
Okay. Now, in the meaning of history, the once Russian Marxist philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev provides a thorough explanation as to why he abandoned the naturalistic interpretation of history. He states, "I remember how the materialist interpretation of history, when I attempted in my youth to verify it by applying it to the destinies of people, broke down in the case of the Jews, where destiny seemed absolutely inexplicable from the materialistic standpoint. And indeed, according to the materialistic and positivist criterion, this people ought long ago to have perished. Its survival is a mysterious and wonderful phenomenon, demonstrating that the life of this people is governed by a special predetermination, transcending the process of adaptation expounded by the materialist interpretation of history. The survival of the Jews, their resistance to destruction, their endurance under absolutely peculiar conditions, and the faithful role played by them in history. All these point to the peculiar and mysterious foundations of their destiny. Scientific criticism applied to traditional biblical history can neither discredit the universal role played by the Jews nor offer a satisfactory explanation of their mysterious destiny." In this explanation, Berdyaev communicates that his departure from the naturalistic interpretation was born out of his ability to reconcile the destiny of the Jews with Marx's economic materialism and the positive criterion. Berdyaev's empirical observations are also independently reflected in the writings of the famed novelist Mark Twain, who affirms, "All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" A similar declaration was made by the trusted advisor to the great King Frederick of Prussia upon the king's inquiry into the existence of God. In response to King's request for proof, the advisor appealed directly to the continued survival of the Jews. Consequently, according to Berdyaev, Twain, and others, attempting to explain the historical events and the destiny of the Jewish people from the materialistic standpoint is certain to court defeat. Certainly, the failure of the Assyrian king Sennacherib to capture Jerusalem speaks plainly to this perspective of Berdyaev and Twain. This event in the annals of Jewish and Assyrian history is a microcosm encapsulating the problems faced by advocates of a naturalist interpretation of history. It reflects their inability to offer a naturalistic explanation for Sennacherib, who on the cusp of victory over Jerusalem suddenly ended the campaign and arbitrarily withdrew his forces back to Nineveh. Accordingly, this momentous event immediately preserved the remaining two tribes of Judah, allowing its people to avoid the likely fate experienced by the upper 10 tribes of Israel. Surely, historical episodes of this nature are what Berdyaev had in mind when he noted that the Jewish destiny reflected the indestructibility of the divine decrees, considering Jerusalem survived virtual certain destruction predicated on the following threat indicators. Firstly, the crowning glory of Sennacherib's third campaign was supposed to be the capture of Jerusalem. According to Yale University Assyriologist Raymond Doherty, the Assyrian king Sennacherib endeavored in this expedition to do for Judah what Shalmaneser V and Sargon II had done for Samaria. The armies of Nineveh always sought to capture the royal city of any country in which they were making a campaign. Since his father, Sargon II, forced Sennacherib to play the role of a government official and never accompany him into battle, Sennacherib had much to prove to his court and the regional provinces on the battlefield. To that end, Sennacherib's legacy among the great Assyrian kings would have certainly been a motivating factor for him to act against Jerusalem. Otherwise, the optics of a conquest to Judah without the capture of Jerusalem would not have lived up to what was achieved in the northern kingdom by the aforementioned kings. Secondly, we need to understand that the defining spirit of this period of history was deeply influenced by the prevailing political and religious ideology. The king was regarded as under the protection of the gods, and this was used to legitimize his position among the people. Such legitimization implied that the military campaigns of the king were under the divine blessing. It was believed that the gods would provide for the king and his army and see to it that their enemies were defeated. This worldview is perfectly captured in 2 Kings. From Sennacherib's delegation, delivering his message to Jerusalem to accept the terms of surrender, whereby he forewarned Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem that Judah's God would be of no help against the might of the great king of Assyria, on account of his mandate of heaven. When negotiations broke down, Sennacherib would have been compelled to act against Jerusalem to demonstrate that the Assyrians' gods were superior to the God of Judah and to justify his divine right to kingship in the eyes of the Assyrian people. Thirdly, and of considerable interest, is that the mere mention of Hezekiah in the Assyrian records seemed to arouse a certain aggressiveness in Sennacherib, preventing him from respectively speaking of Hezekiah as he does of his other enemies. Observe the disparaging and bitter terms Sennacherib used to describe Hezekiah, such as Hezekiah the Jew and the strong, proud Hezekiah, compared to the more conventional epithets of king bestowed upon the rulers of Sidon and Ashkelon he conquered. Along the same lines is the level of effort Sennacherib committed to humiliating Hezekiah in his descriptions. One clear takeaway is it had become personal for Sennacherib, especially since Hezekiah was part of a coalition of kings who had taken part in a rebellion to oppose the Assyrian Empire shortly after Sennacherib's accession. Therefore, given Hezekiah's refusal to submit to the yoke of Sennacherib, along with the contempt the king had for him, Jerusalem should have been captured and a punishment administered among its inhabitants consistent with the actions taken at Ekron. Given the circumstances, how was it even possible for Hezekiah to continue as king of Judah? King Luli of Sidon was replaced, and the king Zedekiah of Ashkelon was deported. Still, unlike other rebellious rulers, Hezekiah did retain his throne, and the worship of Judah in the Temple of Solomon continued uninterrupted. Lastly, it appears evident that the goal of the Assyrian army capturing 46 strongholds in Judah first, before proceeding to the capital, strategically was to prevent the army from having to engage militarily on two fronts, while laying siege to Jerusalem. This tactical decision leaves little doubt that the capture of Jerusalem was a primary objective of the campaign against Judah. Moreover, the confiscation of Jerusalem would have been prime real estate to hand over to several loyal vassals, as Sennacherib had previously done in cutting off the land from Hezekiah and giving it to the princes of Philistia. Although the Assyrian records boasted how Sennacherib destroyed 46 of Judah's cities and trapped Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a caged bird, the city of Jerusalem and its king did not meet the same bitter end. All things considered, a core question remains. What explains Jerusalem's mysterious escape from the armies of Sennacherib that besieged it in 701 BC? Modern scholars have made valiant attempts to rationalize the deliverance of Judah apart from the Jewish and Near East records by suggesting the following naturalistic explanations. Possible explanation 1. Did the arrival of the Egyptians and Ethiopian armies force Sennacherib to leave Jerusalem in peace? The answer is a conclusive no, in consideration of the fact that when Sennacherib had approached the city of Ekron before his invasion of Judah, the officials of Ekron, along with Hezekiah, out of fear, called upon the kings of Egypt and Ethiopia for help. The Egyptians and Ethiopians came to their assistance with cavalry, bowmen, chariots, and a massive army, whereby they joined the Judean troops and Ekronites on the plains of Eltica against Sennacherib. However, Sennacherib was not deterred from his objective, nor did he cut and run on the battlefield on account of the participation of the Egyptian and Ethiopian military. As history reports, Sennacherib was victorious at Eltica against the coalition. He even mocked Ekron's and Hezekiah's actions as cowardly in his inscriptions. The arrival of such an alliance at Jerusalem would have only emboldened Sennacherib as it did at Eltica, not lead to a retreat. Therefore, the theory fails on the merits. Possible explanation, too, could perhaps the great tribute which Hezekiah paid Sennacherib to leave Jerusalem in peace? Theoretically, it's possible. However, Sennacherib does not say that the great tribute which the main rebel Hezekiah sent to him was paid to procure an Assyrian retreat. Rather, it seems that Sennacherib simply ends his account by referring to the tribute of Hezekiah to give the impression that his military campaign against Hezekiah has ended successfully. The political reality is inscriptions are meant to exalt the Assyrian king, and scribes did tend to conceal or explain away certain facts which did not fit this picture. Evidence of this tendency is found in the Babylonian Chronicle, which provides us with another Near East viewpoint on the campaigns of Sennacherib, revealing that when the Assyrian army suffered defeats during its campaigns against Elam and Babylonia, the setbacks were either masked or omitted in Sennacherib's royal inscriptions to give the impression the campaign was successful. Remember, unsuccessful military campaigns were regarded as strong indications that the king was no longer favored by the gods, which would threaten his divine right to kingship and the throne. This establishes adequate motive for Sennacherib to omit military setbacks. Therefore, if we intend to closely follow the facts and clear evidence, considering the aforementioned tendency in the Assyrian inscriptions, we should allow the Jewish, Egyptian, and Babylonian records an opportunity to share relevant testimony of this event. As we examine the historical records preserved in Isaiah, 2 Kings, Herodotus, and Berossus, the following facts should be borne in mind. Fact 1. Whether Hezekiah and his scribes compiled the relevant sections of Isaiah or Isaiah himself, both parties were involved in this event and could provide direct evidence concerning their experience. Fact number 2. Herodotus' references to Sennacherib's third campaign is directly sourced and preserved from the Egyptian priests, completely independent of the Old Testament, and in a sense parallels the Jewish record of the event on many levels. Fact number 3, the Babylonian historian Berossus, via Josephus, provides another independent Near East chronicle of the event, consistent with the biblical record. Fact 4, all 4 sources indicate that the Assyrian army suffered a mysterious setback in its campaign out west. As to the cause of the military setback, all authors report unnatural phenomenon, which resulted in a higher number of casualties within the Assyrian camp. The common agent of death in their respective histories depicts a type of plague. However, this plague is not characteristic of the contagions that advanced on Athens, Constantinople, or Kaffa. A contagion is, by definition, contagious, yet there are no records indicated any manner of infection had spread in the foregoing inhabitants of Jerusalem, neighboring territories, or the people of Nineveh. Thucydides' history on the contagion that fell upon Athens report that the disease broke out in many places. It was not an isolated event. Then there is also the historized detail referencing the instantaneous death of a multitude of soldiers by daybreak. This plague didn't even factor in the amount of time for the disease to begin and end in the susceptible holes. The reports are more consistent with a mob hit than a prolonged epidemic. Now, faced with historical evidence that counters their claims, naturalistic scholars tend to advance explanations that continue to inappropriately rationalize Jerusalem's survival. That seems to avoid dealing with the observable black swan as we have in this case. Their problems rationalizing events of this kind circle back to Berthier's fundamental point. The Jewish destiny is too imbued with the metaphysical to be explained either in material or positive historical terms. Whether we take the statements of Thomas Aquinas and looking at what that definition of a miracle is, it's beyond the natural order of things. And what we see here in this event cannot be explained from a naturalistic presupposition. And in closing my case, when we look at the records coming out of Babylon, the Jewish records, and the Egyptian archives, they all report back on an unnatural phenomenon that we can deem as a miracle, which provides the best explanation for what happened in 701 BC. With that, I conclude my time, and thank you, Dr. Matthew, for listening to my thesis.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. Thanks for unsharing that as well. It is Dr. Matthew Monger's turn, or I'm just going to refer to him, Dr. Mott. We will try to stick to that. And your thesis is up. If you end up not needing all 15 minutes, just let me know, and I will stop it whenever you're ready.
All right, sounds good. Let's see, get into this. All right, you've got the screen up?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Derek, for putting this together, and Jonathan for everything that you've already said. I am really happy to be here, even though I have to reiterate that I'm not the biggest fan of debates, or at least these kind of traditional things with a proposition and then two random people arguing for one side or the other. I mean, honestly, Jonathan, you're a Christian apologist, and I'm a Near Eastern languages and literatures professor. So we have very different things that we're interested in that we debate. And so then it's always going to be talking around each other, maybe more than finding out what really happened or something like that. But even though we might not solve any issues, I think it's fun to talk about these things. So here we go. So basically, my introductory statement could be this. There are no documented and universally accepted angel murders or genocides, so something else happened. That's it. No, so I'm going to say more, but but I mean, that is a massive problem for me as a historian, is that whenever we turn to the unimaginable happening in order to explain something that we propose as being difficult to understand, it's just very, very difficult to have a real discussion about it. Because anytime you say, well, God sent some angels or some plague or killed a bunch of people, God shot hellfire and brimstone and all the people died, and you can't prove it, but you can't prove it wrong. And it's much more likely that it happened than it didn't. There's no arguments against that if your worldview is that God does that kind of thing. But I don't remember the last time I saw that happen or know anyone who would say, other than looking at their own holy texts, which they confirm within their group, which other groups then deny are valid. I don't think we have evidence of that. So that's my first point. I just think that we have an issue anytime we're saying things happen that certainly aren't provable by any other way. So yeah, call me naturalistic. It's not a curse word in my vocabulary to call someone naturalistic. Anyway, so in this specific example, I will talk a little more though, just so you know. In this specific example, which Jonathan really has already laid out pretty well, we're dealing with the question of what happened during Sennacherib's invasion of Levant in 701. And now there is a lot that we can agree on that might not have been easy to agree on if it weren't for the work of archaeologists and philologists. And so we pretty much can agree that something happened in 701 BC. And though I'm sorry, Jonathan, that if we followed the Bible, we probably wouldn't know what year it was, or we would probably get the year wrong, because all it says is the 14th year of Hezekiah. And in 2 Kings, it also says that Hezekiah was the king when Samaria fell, and Samaria fell in 722 or 721 or 723, somewhere at 722, we can say, which means that he couldn't have been in his 14th year, the king of Judah, when Sennacherib came, unless there's some co-regency or some other random counting errors. But I'll grant you that. We're talking about the same time, the same place, even though there might be conflation of different events and there might be some weird stuff. So I'll grant you that. Let's say, yes, Hezekiah, I accept him as king. Yes, we're talking about Judah in the end of the 8th century, so at the year 701. Now, there is a serendipitous situation that we have such a large number of texts that we can look to help us understand that something happened in 701. And that's really the only reason we're having this debate, is because it's not like many of the other Bible stories that there is literally nothing to corroborate it. So here we have something. We have, for example, these Assyrian tablets or cylinders that have the records of Sennacherib that were literally copied within years, a couple of years of his reign. And so these are things that exist. And they tell us how Assyrian scribes wrote about what Sennacherib did. It doesn't tell us history. It's another source that is biased towards the people that are writing it. So just like Jonathan was telling us how we have to discount the Assyrian scribes as just supporting their king and all this, I agree 100%, but we have to also discount the Judean scribes. So that's a good place to start. Now, the Bible also has multiple related accounts here. We have the account in 2 Kings, which is the oldest account. And then we have the account in Isaiah 36, and then another in 2 Chronicles 32. And all of these are different from each other in different ways. And the oldest manuscripts for this are 2nd century BCE, maybe, and this is then 4 or 5 centuries removed from the events that happened. And even though we can say that the text of 2 Kings was probably written towards the beginning of the 6th century, so the 500s BC, we still have a pretty good gap for the text there. So, and the other text we have is Herodotus, which Jonathan's already talked about, a Greek historian from the 4th century who is basically the father of history as a discipline, is the way we talk about him. So Herodotus wrote about history from a critical perspective, and he introduced kind of the world to this in many ways. There's maybe some guys that did it before. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. But Herodotus also bought the stories that he received from people that he thought were trustworthy wholesale. So Herodotus also went to Egyptian priests and said, "Tell me about this," and they told him, and he wrote it down. And so Herodotus is also worth looking into critically. And then, of course, there's other sources, but let's stick to these that we're working with. So if we basically work through the different accounts, we see that there's there's a very common framework. We have this campaign to the Levant by Sennacherib. And Sennacherib, this isn't his first campaign, okay? So Jonathan insinuated that Sennacherib needed to prove himself. Well, this is Sennacherib's second campaign. He was in Babylonia first and fought back and forth, and he never really conquered Babylon, but he pushes the Babylonians back and secures his eastern front, and then he comes back, regroups, and then he goes to the south. So that the idea of this brand new king with a brand new army, that's a little facetious. He's already been fighting for a year, 2, 3, regroups, comes down, and then he attacks down through the Levant. And now the what we agree on through this is that Sennacherib consolidates his kingdom very effectively here. He attacks many of the small and larger towns throughout the Levant and wins this. He fights against Israelites, Judahites, Philistines, and he meets the Egyptians, apparently Egyptians, Ethiopians, Judahites, whoever, on the plains that are on the western side of the Levant, so west of Jerusalem. Now, thus far, they basically agree, and I would say this is where we could basically end the history lesson, because what happens next is that Sennacherib goes home, and this is what we know. Now, Sennacherib, in his annals, gives a report that he had trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem. And the story in the Bible also basically confirms this. So we can say that in some way or another, Hezekiah was confined to Jerusalem. And this is also something that is probably so the idea of the sieges at least is very very confirmed by archaeology, because we find these jars all throughout a number of Israelite settlements and towns and walled towns during this time, Judahite settlements and towns, that are marked with a stamp that is from Hezekiah, and it says "for the king." And these are all from the time of Hezekiah. And basically, what we see is that Hezekiah was storing up goods for possible siege. So he knew it was coming, and he is willing to try and work against it. Now, in 2 Kings, we are told that Hezekiah, I didn't mean to hit that. Hezekiah pays a tribute. He pays a massive tribute of 30 talents of gold and many hundred talents of silver, and he sends it. And this is also found in the Assyrian Chronicles. So we have a massive tribute being paid. Hezekiah has been a vassal, has been sending tributes to Assyria up until just a few years before, when Sennacherib became king. So part of what Assyria is doing here is requiring a tribute from the people that they don't attack and destroy. So that is something that probably also is historically accurate. But after this, then we get into the problems. So we have two different accounts that are basically telling us that something very weird happened and Sennacherib left. Herodotus says it was mice. I don't know if I buy that the mice were the cause of a plague. The Egyptians were quite good at plagues. They knew about plagues, and they could have written that it was a plague. They could have told Herodotus that it was a plague. So I think the fact that Herodotus only says there were mice, and the mice were eating their swords and attacking the people and getting in their stuff. And so it was like, I'm not sure. But anyway, mice force Sennacherib away. Or the biblical account where the death angel comes and kills all the 100,000 people or soldiers or whatever it is. We have this fantastic way of looking at it. It is a way of explaining something that gives power to something other than Sennacherib going back home. Now, I want to, for a second, look at a map of the Near East, and Derek, you just have to shut me up if I get too long-winded here.
I do want you to know, just so you're aware, we have 3 minutes left.
Great. So what I want to say here is that what we have is, so Assyria, the Neo-Assyrian kingdom, started just after this major collapse that happened in the late Bronze Age, the beginning of the Iron Age. There was this massive collapse. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, everybody just had this massive setback at the end of the Bronze Age, so around 1200. And then eventually, the Egyptians are building themselves back up in the south. The Assyrians take over control in the north. And through the course of the 800s and 700s, a number of campaigns re-strengthened the Assyrian Empire. And at the same time, Egypt is building itself up in the south. And Judah, Israel, Tyre, Sidon, Syria, all this is trapped in between these two powers. And what we do know is that Judah and other small city-states in the area look to Egypt for protection against Assyria, who is constantly pressuring. Within a generation after Sennacherib, Egypt does fall. So Egypt is one of the major enemies of Assyria, and Egyptians would be fighting to protect themselves from an attack through the Levant. So let's talk more about the problems we have with what each other says. But basically what I want to say is the fact that Jerusalem remained unconquered is interesting, but it is by no means shocking, and it is by no means supernatural or unexplainable, given the fact that Egypt does not get conquered during the time of Sennacherib, and that the main route to Egypt was along the coast, in the coastal plain, where the Egyptians did fight against Sennacherib, causing massive damage. We have ridiculous many Samson steals from the time of Hezekiah. And Derek, you've actually had somebody on your show recently, Ben, what's his name? Stanhope or something like that, who's talked about these stamps from Hezekiah's time that show that he was influenced by Egypt. So we have this Egyptian influence. We know that this is what's going on. We know that there is a way of looking for help from Egypt going on. And there's no need to say that we needed angels or mice or supernatural events, that an army that had been campaigning for years was worn down and then at this point decided to take their tribute and go. So
your timing was pretty impeccable there. We're about 3 seconds past 15, and I really appreciate that. If you gentlemen need to have anything available to share during cross-examination, just go ahead and have it ready. But I'm going to get that timer started. I'm going to put 60 minutes on the clock. If you guys tap out, that's fine. And we can go to Q&A when we're done with that. I hope that we can get plenty of questions, comments, statements, whatever, in the chat, so that when we're done with cross-examination, the chat can involve themselves in the debate through Q&A or comments. And that also helps MythVision's channel by super chatting. So please consider doing that. All right. Jonathan, you went first. Dr. Mott went second. So we'll have you open in the cross-examination, and I'm just going to allow you to both freestyle. I won't interrupt unless I feel like it's super one-sided at some point and I need to. Sometimes we don't notice that. And there you gentlemen go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Mott, for sharing your thesis. I think you made a number of really good observations. I think I'll touch on one, which I think we'll probably find some agreement on, is obviously Jerusalem remaining unconquered is interesting. Given that I opened up the my thesis, appealing to Nikolai Berdyaev. He, not that saying he initially went to a God hypothesis, but he did notice in his studies and looking at the history of the Jews that there was something interesting about their history, given the number of data points that we have. And we see this observation being made about the Jews when they look at their history from Mark Twain. Obviously, we have the chaplain to the great King of Prussia. So, when we look at Israel's history, not only do they have a number of data points, but they have these anomalies, one of which is 701 BC. Is that enough to start looking seriously? I mean, is there an observable black swan? We see a number of data points, and there's these illustrations or observations being made. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on, Berdyaev's or Twain's comments, and how does it parallel with your statement that it is interesting, the occurrence in trying to explain this?
So Am I? Yeah, I'm unmuted. So I just I don't see why reading a people's texts that are going to be sympathetic to them, and they're reading their history through the way that they themselves want it to be told, should then be equated with history as it actually happened, and then become the source of the kind of claims that you are talking about. So Berdyaev or Mark Twain, people like that, who literally would have been told that the history of Israel is as it's recorded in the Hebrew Bible. And so what you're saying is that no, you can't explain it naturalistically, but you can't explain supernatural claims naturalistically. You can explain history naturalistically and say that yes, we agree that there is a Jewish people, and we agree that they come from the Levant. We probably don't agree how they got there, because I would say that they grew up as a confederation of tribes that developed out of the Canaanite people, and that we have ample evidence for believing that. We know that they at some point would have been exiled. At least some of the aristocracy would have been exiled. We don't know exactly how many. And we know that after returning from a Babylonian period, there was a period of growth, which was then continued up through the Roman beginning of the Roman Empire. And this, after the Roman Empire, the Jews were not destroyed, but they were spread out away from their traditional homeland. And so these are things that we can be very happy about, the fact that the Jewish people have survived all of the many challenges that history has thrown at them. But I have a very hard time understanding what is different about reading Greek history from reading Jewish history, or Roman history, or Persian history, or Egyptian history, because the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians and the Egyptians were conquered by others and were able to win back their power. I guess I struggle to see why throwing out this is the main craziness aspect is that they survived. I think I just don't get it. So yeah, I've been rambling now. So
no, no, and I understand your perspective, where you're coming from. I think from the standpoint of the Jews have always, been a small people. They've been persecuted by these larger empires. Now, one of the things I was going to ask you, because you do bring, you made a really good point about Herodotus. Obviously, he's getting this, getting this preserved story, this narrative. Obviously, when we look at the mice, sort of depicts a type of plague. And the Egyptians, as you pointed out, are familiar with plagues. They know what this looks like. So how much weight do you give not only the Egyptian story, but the Jewish story, and then what we find from Berossus, from the Babylonian perspective, given that these ancient societies all understood what tributes were, they understood what plagues looked like. We see a common thread that they're trying to explain the event, because obviously it's in their neck of the woods. They all come to a story, whether it's an angel in the Bible, like in 2 Samuel, talks about, the angel bringing the pestilence. So this common thread is this sort of unnatural event. How much weight given these societies would be able to tell the difference between something natural or unnatural, that we see the same type of unnatural phenomenon depicting this event in 3 independent traditions.
So I'll grant you that they're 3 independent traditions. I'm not sure they are, but I'll go ahead and this is just the thing about traditions, is that we basically by definition can't know if they're independent. They're independently independently transcribed, I would say. So that means that we, like, I don't think that Herodotus is relying on the biblical account, but I am not 100% sure that the Egyptian priests aren't telling some form of the same story. So these are things that we don't know, because things do happen over centuries, and so but I'll grant you that. So let's call it 3 independent, whatever. So there is a so there's this great chapter in a book that's literally called "As a Bird in a Cage." It's about the 701 thing. It's that was Lester Grabe did the editing for it. But anyway, and it's called something about the skeleton and the fish, and there's different things that we are looking at when we look at texts, and we're trying to understand what may have happened in the past. And when you find a number of accounts that agree on specific definable geographic and historical events. So let's say Sennacherib marching through the Levant in 701. I think that's a skeleton. Okay, so skeletons are reconstructible. We can put dates on things. We can say through archaeology confirm that bone did indeed get destroyed. I mean, we have Lachish is pretty much confirmed that was destroyed during that time. We have other places, so we have archaeological evidence. We have a lot of different things that support the textual evidence, but the fish itself is gone. So all these details, all of the meat of the story that is then the miraculous accounts, the words that are spoken, the things like that. Those are, you may get a close description to something, but when you have differing historical accounts from different contexts, it's really what it shows is that an event can create a wide range of different textual artifacts. Mm-hmm. And so these textual artifacts should not be taken at face value, no matter where they're from. And by definition, the things that are most unexplainable in the text are the things that we're least likely to find historical value for.
No, that makes sense. Now, I did list a number of sort of motivations for Sennacherib to attack, because, I wanted to understand the mindset of him going in. Now, one of the things that you did talk about in your thesis is, obviously Hezekiah was part of this coalition, and that's where I sort of, got when he first came to the throne. Obviously there's this resistance, not only out in the West, but out in Babylonia as well. Okay, we're going to challenge this new king. Now, given that Sennacherib does display a level of contempt for Hezekiah, the king of Judah, he was part of this movement to rebel and form a coalition. He's even helping to agitate it on by calling out for assistance to Egypt. He goes in and makes his mark. Would money even become a factor at that point, given the hostility and the contempt that he felt, not to mention prioritizing his legacy, how it would look for him politically if he doesn't take it. Does it look like the gods of Judah are stronger than the Assyrian? Given all those motivations, the problem that I struggle with is at that point, it's personal. There's a lot of overlying factors, and what is that other factor that would just override all those motivations? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I get what you're saying, but I think so. First of all, I think you go very deep into the psyche of Sennacherib without any evidence. So I agree that the annals do say some hostile things about Hezekiah, but that's the textual artifact. What you're telling me about is the literal psychological state of Sennacherib, and I don't think we can get there. So you're saying that his motivation is his need to make a name, is this, that, and the other, and sure, I mean, maybe so. But he might also have been running out of supplies. He might have been called home for something else. He might have. We just simply don't know, because what happens after Sennacherib goes back is that he then goes and destroys Babylon in the end. And so, like, we literally don't know his motivation, just like we don't know most of the motivations of historical people unless they wrote them down and said, this is what motivates me. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, there is a historical situation where he should be doing this, or he would have been thinking that, or he might have wanted to do this. I just don't find that plausible that we can know that. What we can know is what he did or didn't do. And so after receiving a massive tribute from Hezekiah, he goes back and defeats Babylon. And nothing you can say, Jonathan, I like you, but nothing you can say will make me think that Judah is more important than Babylon.
No,
so he leverages what happens in the Levant to win the war against Babylon. And his son, or I think it's his son, but Esarhaddon, the next king, does go down and defeat Egypt, right? And so I mean, if we're going to say the miraculous events, like, why doesn't Esarhaddon go and defeat Judah if it's so important? It's not. It's because it's not. We get to the point, and he says, and he knows. I mean, there's nothing left to do. He gets all the money. He's destroyed the towns. He's destroyed everything else, and he says, "Now I've got two enemies. I have Egypt or Babylon. I have Egypt, and that twerp that was trapped like a rat in a not a rat, bird in a cage. He's stuck. He has nothing left, And literally, he doesn't do anything about it. The next guy doesn't do anything about it. The next people don't do anything about it. And it doesn't cause the Assyrians any problems.
Would you think his decision to leave Hezekiah there? I think one of the things we see about the Assyrian army or Neo-Assyrian Syrian Empire is like his father, Sargon II, when he deported all the people out of Samaria in that area. He brought people from Babylon. And that was an economic decision, because obviously you leave the land there, you're not going to gain tribute. Now, leaving Hezekiah there in Judah, obviously you cannot, he just took most of Judah. He cut off the land. He was given part of the land away to his loyal vassals. So what are your thoughts on the economic consequences, which, given the Assyrian army, I mean, they were good on economics. But that decision to leave Hezekiah there, not repopulate the area with people from other areas to bring in to help with economics. What are your thoughts on the bad economic policy? Sennacherib does it in other areas. He's obviously deporting people and he's bringing people in because you want to make sure that the economy is whole. But that decision hurts you financially in two ways. Royal vassals would love that military outpost. The high ground, you have steady water coming in. So you can quench your thirst there. But now you can't bring in people from Babylon or anything else because Hezekiah will go after them. So he essentially destroys his economy and he gets an F in economics. What are your thoughts on the economic consequences of that decision?
Have you been to Jerusalem?
Have I been
to there? Have you been to
no,
have you been to the place?
No, I haven't been to Jerusalem.
So, like, Jerusalem is not the breadbasket. There's apparently water. So we have that. It's in the highlands.
Yeah.
It's not the breadbasket. Like, literally the plains towards the coast. That's where you would want to control. That's the road that would be taken by Egyptian soldiers or Assyrian soldiers. That's where commerce was happening. If you the Dead Sea Scrolls official publication is called Discoveries in the Judean Desert, and there's a whole lot of Judah that's desert. There's the wilderness is there, and it falls down towards the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, and up north Samaria, Galilee. The Galilee is lush, right? But Jerusalem isn't a breadbasket. It's the economics of what you're talking about, of a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people living in Jerusalem in the 700s BC and have no contact with anything else because the Assyrians have taken control of the whole rest of the area. I really struggled to see what his bad economic plan was if there was a massive amount of riches in this temple that had been accumulated over years or whatever. If they really had 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver and they ripped off everything and gave it to him, and I don't see where there's an economic failure. The Assyrians don't seem to care. And so I just don't see it as an economical problem, because I think you're over exaggerating the economy of Jerusalem.
Well, and I think my point was not only Jerusalem, but the rest of Judea. I mean, he sacked 46 strongholds. He does, whether it's an exaggeration, he does claim he takes over 200,000 of its citizens.
That's not a good number,
but would you say leaving Judea or the state of Judah as a whole, because with Jerusalem there, obviously Hezekiah can go out and attack anyone he's bringing in, led to bad economics, given that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I don't think so. I think if it was a bigger problem than this, then either Sennacherib or Ashadon would have dealt with it. So I don't see it as a big thing. And I mean, and all these strongholds in these towns, it really brings back memories for me. So I lived in Mali, West Africa for a few years, and we left at the time when the Islamist Al Qaeda in Western Africa and in the Maghreb was attacking. So there's this big war starting in northern Mali, and we lived kind of far towards the north, and so we had traveled pretty extensively in the area that became a battleground. Okay, and the French Foreign Legion lived in the town where we were, right? So it was a kind of a border town, and so we left, and sitting at home, I could watch CNN, the RFI, the French Radio International, and they were talking about towns that I had been in as though they were strategic points in a war. They would say, oh, they've taken Konza. And I'm like, there are 12 houses made of mud bricks there. Like, yes, it's a crossroads, but who's going to defend? I mean, it sounds really big when you put it that way, in a propaganda way, that they're coming, they've taken the strategic town, they've destroyed this, they've done that, they've taken prisoners in the school in Duenza. But like, in the end, like, for the people that are there, it is a massive, huge, scary, big thing. But it's not the same as saying that they've taken Alexandria or they've taken, so Alexandria wasn't there at that time, but they've destroyed Babylon, they've destroyed whatever, any other town. Like, it's an exaggeration of the size and the importance of it, but that fits into a war narrative. And so all of these strongholds, all of this stuff, I don't know. I don't know how many people would have lived there. I don't know how much the economy generated in Judah at this time. But it seems very clear that the Assyrians didn't need to destroy Judah in order to destroy or to take control of Egypt.
Let's see. What questions do you have on my thesis?
Well, I mean, I think actually, because you've brought in a number of things that I wanted to ask you about, and it kind of goes back to this. It's kind of the same thing we talked about last time, last debate we had as well, about the idea that I feel like you're presenting that that destroying. So that Israel is the most important thing, and that for Sennacherib it becomes very important. And so you're looking for motivations, you're looking for ways to explain that the most important thing for Sennacherib would have been to destroy Hezekiah, and he couldn't do it. And I would just want to. I really want to push you on that and ask you, like, what are your sources for that other than your own intellect? Like, how are you reading the sources to say that Sennacherib did not achieve his goal, or that if there had not been divine intervention, that he would have done something different?
I think one of the things that I did bring up is we do have the events at Ekron. We know that there was a rebellious action. They actually deposed the loyal vassal there, Paddy, that was loyal to the throne of Assyria. They actually deposed him. They actually sent him over to Jerusalem, where he was kept under. So their loyal vassal to Assyria was sent to Jerusalem. He was deposed in Ekron. He was sent over. He was a captive of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was sort of a little bit of the ringleader in organizing that sort of rebellion, especially with him coming to the throne. Now, what we see in that particular event is the brutal punishment that awaited for the people of Ekron, their officials, their nobles. Given the alliance, he was emboldened by it. And the punishment that was reserved for the people of Ekron, the officials and the nobles, their bodies was hung all around. And he talks about this, and that was a testament to what was going to happen if you were going to rebel against him. Tribute was still mandatory. All these conquered kings still had to pay tribute, even when Paddy got back to the throne. So tribute was inevitable. You were going to pay that. But when we look at the actions that he takes as a result of the rebellion against the Assyrian king, we see the consequences of it. So this would naturally lead us to that point. Who brought that up? Derek, was that you?
Yeah, that's me. I had it ready because I just assumed we would eventually talk about texts, because that's what I'm here for.
Yes.
So can I then ask you further, because you put so much weight on this, then do you consider this text from Herodotus to be authoritative or true in some way? Like, how are you reading this then as text?
Well, this is this isn't from Herodotus. This is from the annals.
Oh yeah, sorry, the annals. Yeah. So
Yeah.
do you consider this to be? Do you consider that to be some kind of authoritative text or historically true? So how would you use this text?
Well, it establishes a couple of things: his boldness, how he was going to respond to rebellious rulers, and I think the inscriptions do, because even we see at Lachish, the consequences of the people of Judah on account of their rebellion. So I think when we look at the case at Ekron, I think when we look at the case of Lachish, the punishments were pretty brutal that he brought out, and I think we see this pretty consistently in his campaigns that. The punishments were pretty brutal. It's no surprise that some of the kings on that western front on the coastal line, they left. They came out to kiss his feet because they understood defying the Assyrian throne, the consequences of this. So I think the circumstantial evidence is pretty strong. I think you even brought up, the people of Jerusalem, they were preparing for a long siege because they understood what the consequences of their actions were going to be. Is there something in the text that you see? And don't get me wrong. Obviously, there are things that are going to be told from the Assyrian point of view. There's going to be things that are going to be he's going to do a little boasting. He's going to make things seem a little better than what they are. But would you say there's a consistency here that rebellion, when we look at a number of the towns that were sacked and some of the descriptions that were wrought for the punishment of the people, hanging the nobles and the officials of Ekron on poles around the city is to create fear. This is what's going to happen. And he does talk about in the description that, the people that didn't rebel, he wasn't going to take them as spoils. So this sends a message, and I think it's pretty consistent that the Judean people, or especially at Jerusalem, what was going to wait for Hezekiah. Is there something you think I'm maybe missing or maybe not understanding?
No. And that's you can stop the share now if you want, Derek. So then my question for you is just then, when he attributes this to his gods, do you take that as historically accurate too? Did the Assyrian gods give Sennacherib the power to do these things?
Well, he believed he did. He did worship the god of Ashur. And that was the political reality, is they did believe that. He did believe he had the heavens mandate. And I think this is what 2 Kings clearly demonstrates, that whether they're the gods of Egypt or Babylon, that he had the heavens mandate, which goes to motivation, and it goes to intent, that he understood, and which goes into the mindset. He thought his gods were stronger. He brings up the fact that the gods didn't help Samaria or the northern kingdom, and it's not going to help you. So accept these terms of surrender. And I think anything apart from Hezekiah opening up the gates of Jerusalem, doing some sort of public display of killing some of the officers, taking Hezekiah back to Assyria like he's done with other rebellious leaders, even in Babylon. this is what's supposed to happen. So I think the fact that he believed his God was true goes to my case that he would have been motivated to act. Otherwise, he would believe that it would send a message that the God of Judah is stronger than the Assyrian God. So now, whether I believe, now I think what's important here is in that in the spirit of those times, they all believed in the gods. So they did understand that from their experience, gods were real. And I think that's important to understand. Whether his God was the true God is obviously up to debate. But they did believe.
Is it up for debate?
Well,
all right.
Well,
so I feel like I've moved you an inch then.
Well, I do think, they did have a reality that the gods did exist, which does go to my thesis. If there wasn't a natural event, as I believe the Babylonian, the Egyptian, and we could talk about Herodotus in a second if you want to bring it up. I do believe all these traditions in these Near East viewpoints understood the reality of what was brought about, which I do think maybe explains when Ashardadin does go down and finally takes Egypt. He doesn't even deal with Jerusalem. How close of an event would that have been? Something from my perspective spooked Sennacherib to leave town. And I think given that it has come over, that skeleton, into the Egyptian tradition and the Babylonian tradition, and obviously the Assyrian one, I think something happened that they know of. It could have possibly deterred Ashardadin from skipping Jerusalem at that time.
Yeah. So, I have something else to ask, but I want to push you one more time on something, because I asked you about the text, and then what you did was you answered me by citing the Bible and not by talking about the text. So, because I'm interested in the way we're using texts.
Okay.
To be able to say things or not say things, like where the truth value in texts lie. And when I'm asking about whether or not we can take, what you did was actually tell me that you think that Sennacherib does believe in his God, and that we know that because of what the biblical account says about it, right? Now, I would dispute that the words that are put into the officials' mouths in Kings are the actual words that were spoken. They fit perfectly into a Deuteronomistic back and forth that is set in the Babylonian period, looking backward, and they're telling the story of what happened to us, and we won against the Assyrians, but we lost, and our God was challenged, but our God is the strongest, and so there's like this. That is a different thing for me than asking what we can do with the text. Mm-hmm. And so my point was really just to ask whether or not you'll say that we can take certain things at face value where it supports the Bible, but we shouldn't take things at face value where it says something different. Is that kind of the methodology that's there?
No, I think we should take their their understanding of the gods seriously. Obviously the Jewish people can be wrong, but very much like the other ancient civilizations, my point, at least in the opening, is that we do have a people, the Jewish people, that do believe that God talks to them. And I think me and you would both agree that they believe that. They believe that God talks to them. Now, while we may look at a number of ancient texts that all basically say God talks to them too, I think in probably most cases, or in all cases, we would say, yeah, that sounds, in our modern worldview, even for myself, I would say that doesn't sound right. The thing that moves me over to the other side is when we have events of this particular nature within the Jewish history. And I think, when we look at Christianity, we have a central, resurrection event. But with the Jewish history, we have a lot of data points. It's not 701 BC. It's, what they refer to as the miracle of 1948. It's, when we, defeating 5 armies. It's, Egypt. We have all this circumstantial evidence, and I'll just kind of put it from that side. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that I think you even pointed out is interesting. And I think others, and that's where I'm at, Matthew. I'm at, it doesn't mean it defaults to a God hypothesis, but I think when we start seeing the circumstantial evidence become consistent with that idea, that's when I think we need to engage the observable black swan to that point. Now, obviously, if Sennacherib's God came down and destroyed him, well, maybe his God was the true one. Does that help answer it a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I understand it. I guess that's is as good an answer as I expect to get. It's I just think it's really important when we read texts that we acknowledge that people are telling their stories from the perspective that their gods are the true gods, and that this is also part of the interpretive framework of the Hebrew Bible. And so we should be just as skeptical of that as we are of Sennacherib's God being the true God.
Mm-hmm. No,
and so that's the thing, is that I don't, and so then when you say things like circumstantial evidence and all of this, well, I mean, so I don't believe in the Exodus in the way that it's recorded in the Bible. I definitely believe that the Holocaust was real. But I think that's a horrible, horrible thing. I don't think that's a wonderful thing in any way. And so I think it's very difficult to say that God, the God, whatever, has miraculously protected the Jewish people. I think there is a way of saying I am very fascinated with the fact that we do have such a long tradition as we can find in the Jewish people. I think that's amazing. And I am fascinated with their literature, and I have ended up spending my life studying it. But that doesn't mean that there's like the hardships that they have been through is not cannot be seen as evidence for that there is a God protecting them. I think it's actually there's quite many dramatic things that have happened in Jewish history that are quite horrible, and so I think it's a bit. I think it's almost a bit arrogant to try and use it as an argument for the existence of a God that is good. So yeah, but yeah, I guess that's enough philosophizing. Now, I want to ask you also about Herodotus, because do you think Herodotus is writing about Jerusalem?
So what I take from there is, first he's getting it from the priests. I think he identifies pretty clearly in the account that he's getting it from the Egyptian priests. And it's a story that has preserved itself over time. Now, I think we probably both agree that Sennacherib did not take Egypt in his campaign. That was done much later by Assyrian, who takes it obviously much later. So, when I look at the account, just kind of stepping a little bit back, we know that the third campaign did not take Egypt. So then I have to look at, there's a lot of similar parallels in the story when we see Hezekiah going into the temple, the prayer. We look at the sort of, as soon as daybreak comes, the quivers were, eaten off the bows. They didn't have no armies, and then they were slaughtered. So we see the element of an instantaneous death. We also see with the mice, because I think Herodotus does talk about, there stands to this day in the temple of Vulcan, a stone statue of Sethos with a mouse in his hand, an inscription to this effect: "Look on me and learn to reverence the gods." So I see what we have depicted in there is a very strong parallel of what we see in Kings: the going into the temple, the prayer, the deliverance from the gods. And if we parallel this, because even though in Kings and Isaiah, it's talking about an angel, what we see in Samuel is this depiction of, an angel, or the agent of an angel sending like a pestilence down. So it does all lead back to a plague. So when I'm looking at the common threads, and I'm wondering, okay, well, I'm the Egyptians, I'm preserving this story. We didn't fight him at that time. Obviously, this is a level of propaganda that Egyptians would want to say it was our God that took him out, even though he's clearly taking the story from an event. They were neighbors of the Jews. So any such event that would have been significant, the Egyptians would have known about it. Are there points that you want to go over on this?
Again, it kind of goes back to just the question. So this is the text. We just pop it up so that people can know what we're talking about. So
what historical value do you think we can, I guess that's the question. What historical value, given that it's independent in the sense that he got it from the Egyptian priests, and my argument is that there is this parallel with 2 Kings and Isaiah when we look at the elements. So from your standpoint, even though it may have some seeds or some grains, what historical value can we gain from this in looking at this ancient text?
Right, and that's what kind of I wanted to ask you about the same thing.
Yeah.
So let's just go through it together. And so for me, one of the most important things that we do when we work with texts is to take seriously that texts have different contexts, both literary context and historical context and geographical context. And what I mean, just to be clear, like Herodotus is a Greek who is writing a history of Egypt. I mean, he's writing a history in general, but right now this is about Egypt. And so we're in a part of the text where he's saying the next king was a priest of Hephaestus, whose name was Sethos, and he despised and had no regard for warrior Egyptians, and think he would never need them, and blah blah blah. So he's writing about a period in Egypt's history, and he's trying to give the Greeks an understanding of what happened in Egypt, how Egypt was. Right? Do we agree on that?
Yes. I think we agree on that.
Yeah. And just by looking at the way this text is preambled, I find it very telling. Okay, so we're talking about Egypt as being this great. They are a great nation, and the Greeks knew this, that Egypt was something special. I guess as you might agree, I don't know. But so what Herodotus does here is he's making a dramatic scene, because he introduces it by saying the next king despised and had no regard for warrior Egyptians. Okay, thinking he would never need them. And besides otherwise dishonoring them, he took away the chosen lands which had been given to them, 12 fields to each man, in the reign of former kings. Okay, so what Herodotus is doing is making a dramatic effect. He says, there was a king that came along who said, we don't need no armies. So a Democrat, I guess. And then what happened? Well, so presently the king Sennacherib came against Egypt with a great force of Arabians and Assyrians, and the warrior Egyptians could not march against him because the king was an idiot, right? So that's what we're hearing. And then the priest is who becomes the hero. Right? The priest in this quandary went to the temple shrine and there before the god's image bitterly lamented over what he expected to suffer. Sleep came on him, and while he was lamenting, and it seemed to him that the god stood over him and told him to take heart, that he would come to no harm encountering the power of Arabia. I shall send you champions, said the god. Okay? So we have a priest that is lamenting his sure to be loss, and he goes and prays. And then he trusts the vision, and with the Egyptians who would follow him, he camped at Pelusium. So we're not in the plains of coastal Levant, whatever. We're down right basically at the border of Egypt. We're just kind of north of Alexandria a little bit. So Pelusium's not in Canaan, but whatever. So Pelusium, where the road comes to Egypt, none of the warriors would go with him, only the merchants and craftsmen and traders. And the enemies came there too, and during the night they were overrun by a horde of field mice. And then, yeah, of course, they gnawed the quivers and the bows and the handles of the shields, and the result were killed fleeing unharmed the next day. And to this day, a stone statue, like you said, is in the temple with the mouse in its hand. Now, who is the hero of this, and what is actually happening in this text? This is a text where the priest is the hero because he goes to his god and he listens, and it's also it's a funny story, right? It's satirical because it says the king dropped the army, Sennacherib showed up, and the gods had to send their champions, but the champions were mice. I mean, it's just a funny joke of a text, right? But it's a funny joke of a text that does have some memory of the fact that Sennacherib never invaded Egypt. This is not placed at Jerusalem. It does not say that there was a siege. There was not this kind of all the unity of all the people and the Egyptians come to the raid. This is Egypt has no army is the story here. And mice do the fighting because a priest goes out with traders and craftsmen. So yes, Sennacherib did not destroy Egypt. That's historical value here. The rest of the story, fun stuff, man.
Do you think that this story in the Egyptian priest does preserve an element of a mysterious setback by Sennacherib? And would that be consistent with the account that we see in Jerusalem? So talk about the mice, everything. It still portrays a mysterious setback. Obviously, the Egyptians would not memorialize such a great event for the Jews. They would say their gods did it. But would you say, at least the historical value, we can capture that there was a mysterious setback, or we can gain that from this particular text from Herodotus?
Yeah. So thank you for asking. So what I would say here is that what we can learn from this is that there is a memory of Sennacherib as being a great king. Okay. And this I think we agree on. And I think this was a memory that was well known in Babylonia, and this was well known in Egypt. Sennacherib the Great, who destroyed Babylon. Okay. In the generations after. So when is Herodotus, 4th century?
484
5th century. Yeah.
424. Yeah.
So he's a couple hundred years removed, right? so is Second Kings, right? Second Kings, 6th century, sometime maybe.
Jeremiah, yes.
So, but we like the memory of Sennacherib the Great and the knowledge of his campaigns becomes memory, becomes not memory in the sense of you remember it exactly as it was, but memory in the cultural memory sense that people, scribes, would know about Sennacherib, things would be passed down, and what they know is that Babylon was captured. You know Sennacherib was great, but you also know is that Egypt didn't get captured.
Mm-hmm.
That's the question. It doesn't mean that an army of priests and traders and craftsmen went out and defeated the Assyrian army and that something miraculous happened. No, it means Sennacherib didn't attack Egypt then.
Would you think that, when we think about a memory, obviously you think of something important or significant. And the fact that the Jewish records, the Babylonian records, and now the Egyptian records, because it was so significant of a setback, that's why it has preserved down through the Egyptian memory, as well as the Babylonian records too, which does go back, because all three do present some sort of mysterious setback. Now, they can't explain it in naturalistic terms. They just know it was so big that it makes its way all the way down to Berossus to speak about it. I mean, why would he even speak about that unless it was such a huge event? And why would the Egyptian priests mention it or bring it up, except it was such an impact in the region, because what the Jewish records are expounding is something highly significant, something that we wouldn't have expected to happen. And as a result, this memory carried down because of the significance. If it was something like tribute, or they beat up on a couple of them, that wouldn't have carried its way down into legend or memory. But because it was highly significant and no one could explain it, does that go back to, we really need to start looking at this case, to see, what historical value we could start taking out of Second Kings and Isaiah, given that and I'm not sure if you grant Isaiah or Hezekiah were actually there, but someone was there. Obviously, someone was there to take this record. And how much do we put on their experience? This is what they experience. Whether the paradigm of our philosophy doesn't allow us to look that far. When does it allow us to look that far?
Look what far?
Look past that. This is probably pushing the limits of my worldview. That something did significantly happen that I can't explain, which explains why it shows up in all three traditions as a memory.
Yeah, I mean, and I already granted you that it could be independent, so I'm not going to go back on my previous granting. But I mean, I think it's just so. I think we're just so far from each other when it comes to what would be an acceptable reason for this. I mean, you're really looking. You seem to have an idea that the situation was if I've understood you correctly, that what you see is that Sennacherib himself is literally right there, and he's ready to go and cut Hezekiah's head off, basically, and then he just has to turn away because all his men are dead. Is that how you see the picture playing out? Yeah,
that'd be the only thing that would explain the sudden withdrawal back to Nineveh, the leaving of Hezekiah on the throne.
But the only thing you keep saying the only thing. Are you really serious that that's the only thing?
Well, No.
So that having then perhaps having a decimated army that had already fought Egyptians and Ethiopians, that had just spent a massive amount of time sieging Lachish, that had maybe had other issues. We don't know, but we don't know how many soldiers there were. We don't know what shape they were in. We don't know what was happening on the eastern, northern, or northwestern flanks of the Assyrian army. We don't know what provisions they had. We don't know what the plan was. And so we simply don't know whether that motivation is what you say it is. And so that I understand that your attempt to get into his psychology and say he would rather have just gone in and they would have destroyed it. But what if, I mean, we don't know. Maybe there's only 27 guys left, and they sent an emissary from Lachish, and he says, "Hey, we've got you totally surrounded." And they're like, "No way, dude. Well, here's all our money." And he's like, we got away with that one. I mean, we don't know, right? It could have been bluff, right? It could have been a million things, right? And so by saying that it's the only explanation is a miracle,
well,
is to very severely limit nature.
Well, like for instance, if an actual plague it did come about where they trekked it through, they picked it up and it started decimating. Well, you know, it takes time. We would see the spread. The people in Jerusalem would be all wiped out because they were.
Why would we if the army's not there? Because this is the other thing that I completely forgot that I should have brought up, but let's bring it up. There's no archaeological evidence of a siege on Jerusalem. We have a very good archaeological evidence of the Lachish siege. Okay, but we don't have it in Jerusalem. And okay, sure, maybe it's buried in some place that we just haven't found it. Sure, I mean that's another thing. Like it didn't happen, so it didn't happen. But like what? I don't know, man. I just think like if there are just so many possibilities that would still lead to Israelites or Judaites writing a story that says God saved the day. And all the people said amen. I mean, it's just it's a very clear rationalization, as you like to say what I do, of history, but within the exilic and post-exilic understanding of Israel's history, as God comes in and saves Judah up until that final time when he doesn't.
Gentlemen, that's time. We went just 30 seconds over.
Man.
We are in Q&A. Yeah, this was fun. And we're going to get to Q&A. And then once we run out of the super chat questions, I will maybe have one or two. And then let's just go from there. It depends on if my mind is being creative or not. And then, I really appreciate everybody watching and liking the show and helping out in any way. Commenting helps if you can't help out in other ways. Constellation Pegasus. First question. Is there evidence the Assyrian army was destroyed overnight?
No.
I'll qualify my statement here. So when we refer to evidence, I will talk to the documents we have. So I think Barassus makes that affirmation that there was a large multitude. I think he's pretty consistent with 2 Kings and Isaiah. I think the quotation that we get from Barassus lists about 185,000 Assyrians. He says it happened in a night, and he does explain it as now. Whether we want to believe the statement, but as far as wait for our case, we do have that document. And I know Dr. Mott and I spent a lot of time on Herodotus. I think from that standpoint, it does provide independent attestation to a mysterious setback by Sennacherib that parallels. And then we do have the Jewish accounts. I think the circumstantial evidence is, and the fact that we have to deal with is Jerusalem remained, given how rebellious Hezekiah was, and the other rebellious leaders did not. So I think something happened. We do have reports from the Jewish records, from the Egyptian records, and the Babylonians, which do point to high casualties and a mysterious setback that the common thread would be a plague that we've never been able to naturally observe in all known history to act like that. So that's my qualification. Do we have evidence? And I would qualify, yes. The historians, we do have documentation, whether Dr. Mott and others believe the testimony that's, or if there's any historical value in those writings, that's another point.
So I said no pretty quickly, but so then let me just rephrase that as no. There's no physical evidence of the army being destroyed. There is no historically plausible scenario by which a large Assyrian army was destroyed and then would no longer be able to destroy Babylon the next year, which they did. And further, I would say that with a nod to Pelagia and his YouTube channel, this is just then a case of the Bible tells me so, because that's all really that's left. Is there's a story in the Bible that says that this massive army was destroyed, and there's not evidence for it elsewhere.
Real quick, just so I have this right, and thank you for that super chat, Constellation. Jonathan, you're saying not only does the Bible say this, but you're saying Herodotus is also at least saying this, or did we get into the annals? And the annals are talking about the Egyptian priests that are saying something along the same lines, even if it's a different dealing with mice and things like that in a different way. Are they all like collaborating and saying what you're trying to recommend, but there are no other sources? Or
the annals don't say why he suddenly left. It seems to sort of portray, or at least that's my understanding, tries to portray that possibly the tribute was a certain, but he doesn't actually say why he left or if the tribute he received was the factor that got him to leave. And I think maybe where Dr. Mott would agree with me in the sense is we do have the report from Berossus via Josephus that reports this independent of the Old Testament record, in the sense that this is a publication from them. We do have Herodotus, which is getting this from the Egyptian priests. My argument is it parallels 2 Kings and Isaiah very well, and it at least maintains a sort of cultural memory of an independent tradition from Egypt that does portray a mysterious setback by Sennaccherib. And since Egypt wasn't captured by him, it would lead us back to the Jewish account. So my thesis is we have three different Near East traditions, Egypt, Babylon, and the Jewish. So it's not a solely Jewish argument, even though it's the primary, but I would still give a lot of weight to Judah in the sense they were there. And at what point, I mean, we do got to allow their testimony to be heard, whether we believe it or not. It is the experience of the Jewish people. So I think they do have standing to be heard on this. And since they were there, they can directly report on what that experience was. And because we have the other two, there's a common thread. So that's what I would say the evidential case that I'm making. Would you agree, Dr. Mott? Not agree that the story's true.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. Sorry. So
even if you call it a cultural memory,
see, I don't, but I'm not. So I'm not convinced that what we find in Josephus is reliable, a reliable rendition of what Berosus would have said. So I was just there. That's why I paused and got a blank look on my face, as I'm just struggling to find any other confirmation of Berosus that's not Josephus, and I don't know if that's there for that text.
no,
I'm not sure how to read Josephus here either. So I mean, we definitely have a. It's a little confusing because he's talking about Herodotus, he's talking about Berosus, and then we get this thing which is basically a conflation of Herodotus and the Bible, the biblical account, and so I'm very skeptical of taking things that we only have in very late manuscripts and in Josephus, which is what, 5, 6, 7 centuries removed, and then saying that that's an independent witness to the death of a massive Assyrian army. I can agree that Sennacherib's campaign probably was mentioned in Berosus, but I don't know beyond that what the text actually, how reliable we can say the text is. And Herodotus isn't talking about the decimation of an army either. He says that many were killed because they were unarmed. But again, like I don't know how to read that. Like I don't know, other than the context of a satirical funny story about a priest and mice who defeat an army. Like there's, I don't know. It's Veggie Tales for me, you know. It's
Thank you, gentlemen. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for that super sticker early on, my friend. Robert, thank you for the super chat. I did not see a comment or question from you pertaining to the debate at hand. I was looking and I did not see it. So I'm scrolling to the next one here. And it's another one from Constellation Pegasus. Thank you so much for the super chat. Germany survived Rome and 2 catastrophic world wars and are still around and world leaders with Europe, with the EU. Germany is the EU. Saying Jews have survived all these years isn't too much of an impression for me. No miracle.
Well, I'll start off with this. You know, I think one of the points that Mark Twain makes is, you know, they have survived all these great empires, Babylon, you know, the Greeks, Rome, the Assyrians, and they have such a long history. Not to say that Germanica, they don't. Obviously, they were much bigger. For the most part, the Jews weren't this military society, except under, you know, like King David, and what we see with the Maccabees. But you know, we can look at this event with the Jews right after what happened in Germany. After 6 million of their people get decimated, they go back, you know, to an area that no one wanted them. You know, you talk about small militias going up against 5 well-trained armies, 2 of which are led by former, you know, European commanders, a couple of British-trained armies over there, and they defeated 5 armies being surrounded. They call it the miracle of, you know, 1948, because it's just astonishing that these people were able to survive that. And when we look at 701 BC, you know, it has a lot of parallels to that too. They were surrounded. They could not compete. What we don't hear from Hezekiah is he sent out an army to meet them. There wasn't. He actually mocks them. He says, well, I'll give you all these horses. You can send out your best for me, but it's not going to help you. So that's what we're talking here. And I think, you know, and I'll get, you know, Matthew's thought on this, but, you know, Matthew was at least willing to admit that there's something interesting there. Now, he may not take it to where I take it, but I think he would agree that the history of the Jewish people when we look at all the number of data points we have, given that they were not a Rome, they weren't as, I mean, they're not a Germanica, they're not this big group of militant society. They were always a small group. They were always persecuted. Everyone wanted to destroy them. They were not liked, and they still survived. And I think that's where constellation Pegasus probably needs to understand holistically the history of the Jews and their circumstances. But your thoughts on that?
So I totally agree with Constellation Pegasus on this, because I think it. I mean, you can say Germany or you could say Norway. The Norwegians tell a story of them surviving. I'm sitting in Oslo. Actually, I want to just do this just so you guys can see. Like, Oslo is like the most amazing weather today. I'm giving that up to sit here. It's beautiful out there. So everybody come to Oslo in the summer. Anyway, so I mean, Norwegians tell the same story about themselves, the miraculous. They were this amazing people that wanders up into the north in the cold, and they survive on fish and potatoes, and and this, and then they get conquered by the Danes, and they get given to the Swedes, but then like they are still the Norwegians, and it's still it's a beautiful story. You can be a small people against an empire. So I use the word interesting to avoid using something like miraculous or using something like that. It's ununderstandable, because I think also, I mean, look at Polynesian history. I mean, there's the fact that people have navigated the Pacific Ocean in small boats over thousands of years, hundreds of years into the thousands, and finding all these different, populating all these islands throughout the Pacific, is interesting, and it's amazing, and it's even shocking at times, but it's just true. It just happened that way. It wasn't because their god Maui actually led the boats there. They just learned how to navigate the seas very well, and that's interesting. And Germany is also a great example, and I mean, we just have many things. And let's not forget some of the indigenous peoples out there that have suffered ridiculously at the hands of modern empires that do exist, that have made it in the Americas or in Australia and other places that have survived, but their stories aren't told in the way that the Jewish story is told, because they aren't in a position of power. But the Judeo-Christian culture gives the Jewish story such a more prominent place, and so you don't get to hear these kind of things. So yes, I totally agree that Germany and any other place you want to call, we can tell the stories in a way that has been overcoming difficulty.
I was thinking of Greece as well, like with the Greeks, and there's always a lot of interesting. I'm sure you can go to China, you could probably ask anyone anywhere, and they probably have a connection to consider. But I get what you were trying to say, Jonathan, and I understand both sides here, and being one who came from them. Thank you for that super chat, Constellation. We ran out of questions, super chat, so I've got one, and I wanted to pose it in another way in the vein of this very issue. I remember that movie 300. I really enjoyed it. We are Sparta. Yeah,
that's where you got your MythVision thing from, isn't it?
MythVision. Maybe. I don't know. There probably is some subconscious reasoning that I chose. I didn't think about that actually until just now. But in that movie, they play it kind of like a handful of Greeks, joined the Spartans to go fight this battle against 2 million Persians, as the account says. Whereas like Herodotus says it was probably like 2 million, but it was probably more like 100,000 or a couple 100,000 versus this small fleet of Spartans and about maybe 5,000 to 7,000 Greeks. And they survived the war. Now, my question is to you, Jonathan, is this a miracle that the Greeks and the Spartans actually survive against such a massive army of Persians in this battle? Or would you say there was strategic advantage and natural reasons we can say that they funneled the Persians in and were able to tactically, naturally kick some ass? Or were the Greek gods on their side? Or was Yahweh helping the Greeks? So like, where do you draw the line in your worldview? And then I'd love to have you, Dr. Mott, to tag on.
Well, first, we understand a lot about the Spartan society. So they are a military community. They're spot checking their children very early on to make sure if they're going to be ideal candidates for their military. You can't just make the 300. And I think what we see, when we look at that particular event, we knew they weren't going to win against the Persians. The purpose of that event is that they could stand toe to toe. They were the better fighters. While the Persians had all these tricks and they had all these people, they weren't the Greek fighter. They weren't the Spartan. So the individual Spartans on their own can handle themselves. So when we look at that, we're talking about a military community. Obviously, that event gave them the courage to know that they can actually defeat a much bigger army. And I'm not saying it's a miracle. Tactically, they had a better advantage. They were the better fighters, and it'd be interesting to hear Dr. Mott's thoughts on that. But I would say the Greeks were the better fighters, while the Persians had slaves and they had all these resources at them. They weren't the military community of the Greeks.
Can I just to right here, so I get this one specific answer though that I think is important, and then I do want Dr. Mott to respond. I guarantee you, in their accounts, they will claim their gods helped them.
Yes.
So my question is, did their gods actually help them? If you're reading their literature and we're treating their literature fairly, like you would hope someone reading the Bible would at least say, well, the Israelites actually believe that Yahweh helped them. If I'm reading Greek literature where they say their gods actually helped them, do you believe that the Greek gods actually helped the Greeks in this battle? Or do you believe that it's really the God of Israel that's helping the Greeks in this battle? You see where I'm trying to get at? Because, how do we know they didn't have their gods help? Anyway, but go ahead.
Yeah, so, from a theological perspective, and this, Derek, and maybe Dr. Mott does too, I do hold as an Anglican, I do have a strong Calvinistic, framework. So obviously, I don't look at gods as a way of just sitting up there. So obviously the Judeo-Christian God is in control of all things and shaping this course of events for his people. So no, I wouldn't say it was the Greek gods, even though they believed that their gods were on their side as the Persians did. So, from a theological perspective, God is in control of all things and sets the course of these events in history. And I think what we can at least say from the Jewish history is he is creating a sort of design for his people. We at least get that idea that there is this design of history, that he's laying out these courses, which as Dr. Mott and I talked about before, part of the shaping of that history was that peace and the reestablishment of Jerusalem during the Persian Empire. So I would say in that regard, God was very much in control and provided a nice little plush history for the Jews of peace while they were fighting with the Greeks. So yeah, I wouldn't attribute it to their gods, but they all believed that the gods did exist. And I think it's important to take away from that, while their gods may have not been the true God, they all did believe in some higher entity.
Dr. Mott?
Yeah. So, obviously, Derek, I agree with you. And I posed that exact question kind of about Sennacherib's text as well, just to kind of try to weed out that same point that all the texts we have from antiquities that are about wars being fought attribute their winning that war to their own gods. And sometimes those people just kept winning and winning. Like, so with the Greeks, it's they still exist, but I'm not sure you find a lot of Greeks that would attribute the win to the Zeus or whoever. But but it's just, for me, such a cop out to say, oh well, they believed in some gods and it makes it okay. We don't need gods to win wars. Like, I mean, seriously, like, my personal conviction is that if we really had a god that was a supreme being, we wouldn't be fighting wars. Like, if somebody could actually get into history and make things change, like, why would we need to be fighting wars? Like, if there was actually that supreme being, I don't know. But it's just like, it's so clear that historical texts that describe events and then attribute them to their god, like, it's a part of what you did in antiquity, and that's just like, it doesn't mean those gods exist. It doesn't even mean that they're as convicted to them as we seem to try to make it. Like, we don't know if Sennacherib was like a born again Assyrian. Like, we don't know what people actually thought. Like, I mean, we don't know if the Greeks really thought Zeus was alive on Olympus or whatever. Like, we don't know these things. Like, we can, probably the opposite is true, that people didn't have modern evangelical faith about their gods in antiquity to the level that we like to portray them at. Like, it's somewhat of a So I mean, I think we really get ourselves into trouble when we read texts in that way of saying that the Jewish one, they are talking about the real God, but then everybody else was talking about some other thing.
Thank you, gentlemen. Bob the Ghost comes in with a super chat. Is there anything unique about the Hebrew war accounts in the Bible compared to other Near East nations' accounts of the time? E.g., we win equals our God delivered us. We lose equals God's punishing us.
So I mean, so this is a really good question, and it's a good question because the answer is actually that the what's unique about the Hebrew war accounts is that the opposite is true. Because we have the account of the Israelites falling, Samaria falling to the Assyrians, and then the Jerusalem and Judah falling to the Babylonians, that are pinned on God. Like, that is God's will. And so it's not only their winning that is attributed to God, but also their losing. And that's pretty special. So, and I guess that's the Calvinist perspective. But it is that thing that Jewish history in the Hebrew Bible is written from the perspective that everything must have been God's will. And so it's looking backwards towards the events that they have memory of, and saying, why did they happen? And the answer is always because God did it, or God allowed it, or God invoked it, and that's different than saying only that when we win, God did it, or if we lose, God is punishing us.
Jonathan, did you want to make a remark on this, or do you want me to follow another question?
Yeah, no. For me, one of the cases I've been making in all these discussions that, Dr. Ma had the opportunity to share the Isaiah, discussion. It's never about just one case. On your show, I defended the Exodus, but they all have a common theme or interesting fact about the accounts. If we look at the Exodus, what would have made, if that was the case, the Egyptians to allow all those slaves to leave, why would some of their people also leave too, unless they experienced something that they couldn't explain that seemed consistent with the Jewish ideology? In our last debate, we talked about, what best explains, why the Persian king allowed for the resettlement of Jerusalem and the sponsoring of these particular activities. And we see a level of peace. So there's a lot of circumstantial pieces to my case. Even here on 701 BC, we see enough of these data points. That's a saying that, when we look at what happened with the Maccabean revolt, and it's pretty extraordinary. I think we can all say that they were able to beat, that army, the sort of Macedonian phalanx, they were able to beat. But we have these continual cases of these mysterious events there's enough of them in the Jewish history that does start to allow us to question, and hence why I bring up, Mark Twain, or who wasn't a believer, but he made an empirical observation that this looks odd, to say the least. Berthier, is like, I've been a follower of Marx all these years. The Russian Revolution's about to start because of these ideas. And this is a guy who breaks away from it because of what he's looking at the Jews. He didn't say this about the Polynesians or the Germans or anyone. He said it was the Jews that did it. So I think there's enough there when we look at the data to say something's different here in their accounts that's tough to explain. We don't have to say that it's miraculous, but I think there's enough there to say not only interesting, but it does arouse our curiosity.
If I may, I'm going to get one more of my questions in. If anyone has a last minute question before we wrap things up, I want to direct this at you, Dr. Mott. And my question is, we've done a presentation today where you're pretty much trying to use what we can know based on the literature and facts and archaeology and such on what happened. And so to be direct, do you think, and tell me what you do think, but do you think that Hezekiah was like, okay, I'm a bird in a cage, I'm in a bad spot, try to get help from these guys who are on my side, and like they're not coming through. I'm going to give as much gold and money and just say, dude, I'm sorry. Like, please don't crush me and destroy me. Here's a lot of money. And he pays off this guy, Sennarcherib. And he's like, all right, your surrender's enough. I've got enough money. I can go and get more troops to continue. What do you think actually happened in this situation? And maybe a bit speculative here. Yeah. But then also, not only what do you think happened, why do you think all these other accounts came up, from mice and the Bible saying an angel of death and all this? What do you think? Why do you think that developed? So there's two questions in one.
Okay. So, I mean, you're putting me on the spot because I like to be a nihilist when it comes to that kind of stuff, and just say there's nothing really there.
What's it look like to you?
But what it looks like to me is that the Assyrian army, I think the Assyrian army did fight the Egyptians. I think in the plains of Palestine somewhere, and I think they probably did meet resistance throughout the Levant in different places. And I think they did lay siege to Lachish. And I think that at that point, the army was stuck and was on hold for a while. And I think that basically, I think the most plausible thing is that the Assyrians were tired of fighting. They were not as strong as Jonathan would like to make them sound at that point, and that they were weakened, and that they were maybe not bluffing, but that they were pushing for an end to the conflict. They were ready to go, and Hezekiah didn't know the extent to which they were ready to go. and he paid the tribute. He had been paying tributes up to just a few years earlier, and he knew that the best way for him to stay there was to pay a tribute. And so I think that this led to the Assyrians returning to Assyria, returning to Nineveh, and then turning eastward once they had recuperated. So I think there's just it's a pretty simplistic thing. There was no longer a threat in the south. They basically had destroyed a lot of the towns. They had fought back and met resistance from the Egyptians, but didn't really think that was a huge threat of Egypt coming. Egypt never really came as far north as Assyria. They had settled their kind of score there, and then that's it. So for me, it seems like it was, I guess, a natural ending to something that no longer had any value. I don't see that there's any value left in the continued campaign.
Now, what about the later stories that we find from mice and priest and God and angels of death and all of this? Why do you think those stories were said? If there was, what do you think? Yeah.
Right. And so and again, I want to point out that these are told by people groups that would have been in the area, that would have known about the Assyrians, and they're told in a way that both shows that they see Sennacherib as a great warrior king, and that they think that it would have taken a miracle, or would have taken some surprising thing in order to defeat the Assyrian army, right? So this shows a respect for Sennacherib, and it also each of them are woven into the fabric of a national myth or mythos, right? So the Egyptian thing is, I mean, we went through that text, and that's one of the things I wanted to do is show that this is really an Egyptian text that's lifting up the Egyptian priesthood as opposed to Sennacherib, saying, no, the king and the warriors, they couldn't defeat Sennacherib. The priest and his mice defeated Sennacherib. And that is like, it's not something you need a historical miracle to say. There are lots of events in history that probably didn't happen in the miraculous way that they're described in texts, but they're just recorded in a way that makes the recorders sound very cool and amazing. So I think that the cultural memory of Sennacherib, the memory of the Assyrians and their armies, makes a good muse, or makes a good kind of I guess straw man to knock down. You put him in the story, and that's I think it makes perfect sense that that's what happens, because that's the same thing that happens to Pharaoh in the Bible, like Pharaoh being defeated by Moses in this fictional account of the Exodus, is basically the same thing, where it's like, oh, well, we're Israelites and we know about a Pharaoh, and so you talk about it, but like it's again, it's a story of how somebody throws down with Pharaoh and wins and gets away with it. And it fits into the national religious framework that story is telling. If you read that in an Egyptian story, it would be pretty cool. Like if it was actually an Egyptian text that said this dude showed up and he threw down and we let him go, like that would be different. But when it's sewn into the fabric of the story that you're telling to prove that your history was special, it's not surprising.
Jonathan, I got to give you the last word on that one, and then we have one more super chat.
I not to bewilder the point, once again, my thing is we do have documentation of an event that seems to identify a mysterious setback. And I think that's the consistent thread He's already showed just cause taking 46 strongholds, whether they're small farms, little villages, 2 houses. He did go through the area of Judah. He did take all the coastal cities. A lot of the kings were leaving, bowing at the feet, giving him whatever he wanted. The people at Ekron, they still had to get paid tribute after they got annihilated over there. So tribute was going to happen regardless. If I'm an army, and I just take down 46 cities, and that is the last one. That is the crown jewel. That is the Samaria.
Is it the crown jewel? Sorry, is it the crown jewel? How do you know that? How do you know that?
Well, from history, it's been attacked by almost every great empire. I think the history.
Which one? Babylonia?
Babylon. Babylon.
Which other ones?
Rome took Jerusalem. The Assyrians tried to take it. The Muslim nations have taken it. Britain took it.
So we're talking that history. So, but up to the time of the Assyrians, I'm asking.
Yeah.
What is the importance of? So before Assyria, what's the importance of Jerusalem?
Well, I still say it's the military high ground. It's looking over the coastal cities. It's right there. No,
it's not. You can't see the coast from Jerusalem. You're exaggerating. This is. I mean, it's making Jerusalem sound like this amazingly important thing. It is amazingly important for the Jewish story, but it doesn't mean that it's amazingly important for the Assyrians.
Well, you do give. I mean, is it more important than the? He was giving away land. If you want to get real estate that does have water, I think we agree that there's water there. It has fortified walls, so you can give it to a loyal vassal. It has people there that you could deport, which were resources for their economies. So whether it's 10,000 people or 100,000 people in Jerusalem, they did have people that recognize have resources that you can give away. So there is value there, and the fact that you can bring in all your people once you control the land, to bring in your own people back to Judah and get economic wealth out of it. Land is value in the ancient world, and I think that one, I call it the crown jewel. I think even if it for whatever it's worth, it didn't have the best of resources. The imagery of taking Jerusalem against Hezekiah would trump any economic value if it was, in some theory, lacking. Taking his hometown where he lives, this rebellious figure to you, would have important intrinsic value for him.
Thank you, guys. Let's move on to the next one, and then we'll be wrapping things up. Vaguely agnostic with the 666.
Nice.
Could it be that Judea was insignificant and the Bible is just fan fiction? Where are the maps showing Israel ruling the Mediterranean?
Yeah, and this is a good, maybe more popular way of saying what I've been trying to say. So thank you, vaguely agnostic, because I totally agree that Judea was, insignificant is maybe is a relative term, and that's what I'm trying to get at. Is that significance is a relative term, and so the significance of Judea is massive for the Jews, but it's not massive for everyone else. And yes, the Bible is fan fiction. Of course it is. Like that's what religious texts are. Gosh, you need to do an episode on the Gospels as fan fiction, Derek. That I'll give you some references. But it's just like the thing is that that again and then again and again, when we actually study with an open mind the history of the Levant, the history of the ancient Mediterranean, history of the ancient world, and use the same criteria to evaluate the texts of the Hebrew Bible as we use to evaluate other sources, then we have to come to the conclusion that there is nothing special about Jerusalem. You can tell a story about it, but when you remove all of the ideological fan fiction or theology or whatever you want to call it, what we end up with is a story that you could tell about any of 100 different places that were passed off between different factions or empires or whatever throughout history. And it is what it is. Like, Rome didn't think of Jerusalem as the thing they had to deal with first. Like, they didn't. Yes, Rome did get tired of the revolts and sack the city, but Rome didn't go there first. Assyria didn't go there first. Babylonia didn't go there first. That wasn't Alexander the Great didn't go there first. It wasn't like these great leaders in history built their massive empires by going and sacking Jerusalem, and thereby they had control of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a little city up on top of a hill in the highlands of Judea that may not even have been bigger than Lachish during this time. And so we simply just can't continue to over-evaluate it in that way.
Jonathan, did you want to make a brief comment?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we have to take in consideration when we talk about what Jerusalem represented, I think Tacitus does a good job of, these people in Jerusalem, they bought these constructed these big fortified walls because they knew they were in for long wars.
When were the walls constructed?
When was the walls constructed?
Yeah.
Well, obviously before the Assyrians.
Which walls are you talking about then?
Well, they're fortified walls. Just the barriers that they're putting in place. And I think what Tacitus was saying there is they were viewed as rebellious people. I think all the empires had this thing, and obviously, the Assyrians did think they were rebellious because they were. Hezekiah does demonstrate that. And they knew they were in for long fights or sieges, and this is why they kind of built. So they kind of represented, this strange religion to these ancient societies. They were stealing people over to their religion, and it created a sense of anti-Semitism, which does talk about why the ancient world, why they were being attacked so much. So when we look at Jerusalem from that perspective, and the ancients speak about that, and Tacitus goes into, detail, that they weren't liked, people thought they were rebellious. The Persians, this attitude is reflected there. It's reflected in the Assyrians, which does go to cause why you want to take these people out. And so when we talk about Jerusalem, we're talking about where they worship. You had the Temple of Solomon. It means very much to them, and you're right, Dr. Mott. It does. So if you're going to take these people out, you take them out their home base. It's sort of like the Mecca. While we may not think it has tremendous value, those people do, and their enemies did understand that. And I think that's where we see the significance. What it meant taking these people was important to them. So I think that's what it represented to the Hellenistic world, the Assyrians, even the Persians, the Romans. That's why you expel them from the land, that we see Rome did, because not that, I'm going to get this great power, but what it would have meant to them. And this is what we see from the various empires. I mean, even in Babylon, I don't have to have Jerusalem, but what this rebellious people, I'm going to destroy what's most sacred to you. And I think that we have to factor in.
I got another super chat here, gentlemen. Aaron says, Hezekiah was not a pious king, but a politician. Compare Isaiah to 2 Kings. Sennacherib, or however you want to pronounce it, had many issues in his empire. Ending a siege could happen. And then followed up with Sennacherib did not die right away. Bible. So, thank you for the super chats. But comments?
No, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And so there's a guy here at my university that's doing his PhD on Hezekiah and how Hezekiah gets whitewashed in different texts. I mean, he gets he's given a clean slate, and how you can see the development kind of this stuff. And one of the things that you could look at actually you could if you'll just allow me just 30 seconds, if you pop my my screen back on there. So if we look at on the so we have 2 Kings. The 2 Kings is the left, and the Isaiah 36 is the right, and so in 2 Kings we have this text that is about Hezekiah. This is the 14th year of Hezekiah. King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. And then we go to and Isaiah 36 is exactly the same. But then what happens in verse 14, which is the next verse in 2 Kings, says that King Hezekiah of Judah sent to the king of Assyria Lachish and said, I have done wrong, withdraw from me, whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria demanded of him, blah, 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 blah. And Hezekiah did it, and blah, blah, blah. And he stripped the gold out of the temple, and he did all this stuff. Isaiah doesn't record this, right? And because Isaiah is part of this whitewashing of Hezekiah. And so the memory of Hezekiah is changing as the texts are developing. And so the use of Isaiah 36 or the use of kings in Isaiah is then kind of trying to give Hezekiah a different story. And then when you go back and it continues then in verse 17, there's a little bit different. There's a couple of details that are different in 2 Kings from the Isaiah story, but then after that they're basically identical again. So you can take the share screen away. But the thing is that like Ariane is saying is that like Hezekiah is depicted as a pious king in later texts and becomes more and more pious as time goes by,
like King David in a way.
Yes, exactly. And like, I mean, if you compare David in Kings versus Samuel in Kings versus David in Chronicles, it's two different guys, right? And so David in the Chronicles being written in the 4th, 3rd, 2nd century sometime, which is a few hundred years after Kings was written. The stories about David, him being an idiot and a bad person, kind of are whitewashed. They're cleaned up. He's given a better reputation in the later texts, and so like this is the way texts work, and that's different than history, and that's why we have a hard time saying what was Hezekiah like. I don't know, but we know that the earlier texts describe him as trying to find a way out of a problem, and the later texts really make it clear that he's doing the right thing by God, and as you say, that last little point was just that Sennacherib doesn't die immediately, and that's true. Like you could read the Bible as implying that Sennacherib was murdered like immediately after these events happened, and he wasn't, but he was murdered later. So yeah.
Jonathan, any remarks from you? And then
and I would agree. Of course he was a politician. He's running Judah. I mean, he's the king of Judah. Obviously there was a political calculation at the ascension of Sennacherib's ascension to the throne of Assyria. This is Sennacherib, Sargon's the second son. He's not battle tested. and let's form a little coalition and revolt. I'm not going to pay tribute anymore. And he gets other, coastal states to kind of buy into this as well. So he's sort of the leader. So we see a political aspect of what he's doing. Someone comes to the throne that you feel that you can take advantage of. Babylon did that too. So they sense weakness after Sargon II. So there's a political reality to this as well. And I think what the political calculation that you see in Second Kings with tribute being offered, while they're devastating Lachish, that makes sense. That's a good political calculation. He's on the, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 miles just down the road from Jerusalem. I mean, it's the closest place. And, all of a sudden he's on your doorstep. When he's on the coastal cities and you're just sending some troops to help out Ekron, it's not like when he pulls up to your front door. So obviously he needs to make a political calculation there as well. Why Isaiah or Hezekiah didn't put it in there, who knows? They didn't tell me. But it does show a political reality. Now, the only thing I would mark about that is, once again, we show, we know in the Assyrian records, a delegation was sent to Lachish. And we have Second Kings that's saying that the tribute was offered there. Now, which does go to the point, did Sennacherib violate the peace treaty by marching on Jerusalem? But I think what we see there is, I don't think he ends the siege. And I think, I know Dr. Ma references Babylon. We know what he did in Babylon, and we know that there was some personal issues, such as his son, possibly being captured, and he went in there and just leveled the place. So he did take things personally. He looked at a lot of the actions amongst the Babylonians as rebellious, and we saw what happened to them, which just circle around to my other point. Why does Jerusalem still exist? Babylon was destroyed. I mean, he leveled the place, and it was personal. He did take things personal there. Obviously, I don't know your thoughts on that, Dr. Ma, but he was pissed, and he leveled the place. He dug up the foundations. I'm thinking that should have happened at Jerusalem. He shows the same hostility. So, that's sort of, I don't think he ends the siege. I think that's the part that I have trouble with. Whether, I love the fan fiction. That's the problem that I have trouble with. So to say he just ends the siege, well, where did he do that? Where are the examples? Now, when he had military setbacks in Babylon, so against Elam, he did have military setbacks, and the Babylonian Chronicle provides us that.
Yep.
And in these records, in the Jewish records, and what we see in Herodotus, there was a military setback. That's why he ends a potential assault. So, what was the setback?
Well, I mean, I think that's a logical problem there, to say that the only thing that could cause Sennacherib to turn back would be a military setback. That's just, I don't see that you can make that statement, because we simply don't know if that's the fact or not. So, I mean, he could have turned back for any reason that he wanted to. He was the king, and he. Well,
yeah, no.
I don't think you can make that claim. But the broader point is like, and thank you for making this point for me, because I should have made it before, is that he literally turned back from Babylon without conquering it the first time. He had to go back another time. He cared more about Babylon. He did go back and crush it. Mm-hmm. So, like, again, it's just the view of Jerusalem that you're taking. He takes Lachish, he gets his tribute, and he says, now I'm going to go finish the job that I actually care about.
And if I may ask, didn't Babylon, after it was completely destroyed and its foundations dug up, eventually rebuild?
Yeah. And so this
wouldn't that
whole
mean
thing
that
about
it's
completely, and this whole thing about completely destroying Babylon. Also, we don't know if that's true. I mean, that what is true? What is completely destroying? What is leveled to the ground? I mean, we don't know these things, and so it's like we know what the texts tell us, and so that means that we know what's in texts. We don't know what's in history. We know that Babylon was eventually completely destroyed, but that's different than saying that it was destroyed by the Assyrians to the ground and then rebuilt again by the Medes or whatever. And it's just, again, we're just getting into all these details that we don't know exactly the specifics of because we don't have the data. And so what we really can't do is say that Sennacherib would have destroyed Jerusalem if he could have, but he didn't. But he destroyed Babylon the second time he went there because he was mad, and then he must have been just as mad at Jerusalem. Therefore, like, the logic just doesn't work. I mean, it's just like all these if, ands, and buts that really aren't lined up logically for me. Like, it's what we know is that Jerusalem wasn't destroyed, and then we can rather go from that and say, then if he had the power to destroy Babylon, he would have destroyed Jerusalem at some point if it really mattered, but it obviously didn't.
Guys, thank you so much. Last one is Louis AKK.
Yeah.
Please have Christine Hayes and Benjamin Sulmer on. I have emailed Christine Hayes. I really seriously wish that she wasn't extremely busy. I will try again. She has emailed me back after my 9th email. I'm not kidding you. I'm pretty persistent, and she finally was like, I am right now, my family and everything. She's got a lot going on, so she isn't able, but I really wish she was. I would be willing to fork up some money to make something like that happen. She's just a goddess. I really love Christine Hayes. I wish I could get her on. And Aaron says Babylon was leveled because they killed his son. So this is in agreement with the furious idea that you had, Jonathan. I really appreciate both of you gentlemen. I want to give a quick plug here. Everybody go subscribe to Jonathan's YouTube channel. If you don't agree with his ideas, at least for the freaking cartoons, you can get a laugh out of some of them, actually, when you talk about James White and all this stuff. There's some really cool stuff. You have intro cartoons that I always enjoy, and we will be doing a plug that you'll be willing to do. And this is I can't tell you how much work he puts into these cartoons, but when you do the debate with Robin Walsh, there will be like a super chat raffling type thing where we're going to have names drawn out of a hat. You can automatically get one of the cartoons. What did you say that it was? Like, if they super chatted what?
So if they super chat $250 to your channel, they get an automatic 30-second cartoon. So, and once again, I'm doing this to support MythVision. I'm going to donate my time. So they do $250. That will automatically guarantee you a 30 up to, we're only going to do 5 of those. But if you just want to give starting at $25, anyone makes $25 or more, they'll be raffled in for a 30-second cartoon at the end of the next program. We'll jimmy it up. Someone will put their name in. Obviously, the more you give, if you do 25, you'll get 1 ticket. But I think if you do $50, then you may get 4 tickets. If you do 100, then you may get like 10, 12 tickets to increase your odds on the cartoon. So
absolutely. And just so that nobody's like, I guess, cheating the odds, I do want to do a drawing. So if there's 4 people who do want to actually guarantee their intro, we need to leave at least a 5th one available for the drawing. I want to make it fun. So if we end up getting 4, I want to make sure we draw that line like, hey, no shortcutting to it, unless you yourself say, I'll do a 6th, but I can't tell you how much work's going to go into this. So I really appreciate that. Please subscribe to his. Also, Dr. Monger right now is only on Academia. Right now, in terms of what we have from Dr. Monger, go to Academia, follow him, if not for the very reason I do, and that's to be getting the emails and notifications whenever something else comes up, especially when it comes to Dead Sea Scroll material. Dr. Monger, did you want to mention anything about your Academia?
Nah,
We need to make Dr. Monger a YouTube and get him like an intro cartoon of all his studies. I'm
going to tell you what, last night I did make a funny little joke, and I was like, well, Dr. Mott, yeah, we've got it all figured out. So tomorrow, if you don't show up at the last second, you turn away, then we know it was a miracle. And we were being funny in the chat. So yeah, go subscribe to his academia if you want to learn a thing or two, especially when it comes to Dead Sea Scroll. Help us out at MythVision, joining the Patreon. You can literally join as little as $3 a month, and you access all the videos. So if you're wondering, like, if I sign at the lowest amount, will I access all the videos? Yes, you will. A lot of people have that question. Please consider that. Don't forget to sign up for Bart Ehrman's Unknown Gospel course. And any final words from you gentlemen as we're exiting this debate?
I've enjoyed the conversation. Obviously, Dr. Ma and I have different worldviews, and obviously we're looking at the data probably differently, But I actually enjoyed the time with Dr. Ma. He understands the history. He knows the literature very well. He knows the circumstances and the events around the period. So he's very well versed. And this is what intrigues me from sitting down and talking with, scholars like Dr. Ma. They know their material. They know it much better than I do. They're well researched. They know the languages. They know the context. And this is what drives me to have these conversations, is because we can actually sit down and while maybe my arguments are fair, fan field, I do try to put together an academic response in defending the Judeo-Christian worldview. And while it sometimes maybe not appear to, I do a lot of research, go through a lot of the literature into presenting the best academic case that we have. But once again, Dr. Ma, is always a pleasure to speak with you, sit down, and share my views on this.
Yep, thanks, and thanks for including me, guys. I enjoy this kind of thing, sometime Derek we'll do some more stuff. Got lots to talk about, but yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think we at least are respectful of each other, so I never feel like we're crossing any lines. So keeping it real.
Thank you, gentlemen. And never forget, ladies and gentlemen, like the video, comment, and we are MythVision. Check out Jonathan's cartoon.